Hi everyone, this is lecture 12, the final lecture of POS 201, Introduction to Political Theory. And today we talk about Michel Foucault, his writings on the genealogy of power and what he calls regimes of truth. And if it's unclear exactly what those things mean or what he's referring to there, hopefully by the end of this lecture it'll be clear what he's talking about. Now, as I said at the close of last lecture, Michel Foucault is notoriously hard to sort out. He's really complex, and he uses this sophisticated language. Some people say that he uses a lot of jargon and kind of creates concepts and creates words, and that can be difficult. That can be difficult to work through. But he's also really important, I think, and I think there's a really rewarding set of insights that we can access through Foucault. Not to mention the fact that he kind of takes everything that we've read thus far and flips it on its head. So I think he's a good way to end the course. Now, Foucault is probably most influential for his writings on power. He says that if power is going to operate, if power is going to be effective, then power really doesn't flow from a single center. And it doesn't flow back and forth between different kind of locations within a society or within a country or any sort of institutional setting. It really flows in every direction. We all exert power against one another, and he talks about this notion of discipline. He says a disciplined society is one that follows rules and norms, and in that setting, we're constantly exerting power against one another. And we're constantly watching over each other, defining what is normal, defining what is abnormal. And so he helps us rethink power in certain ways and kind of moves us beyond certain conceptions of power that we encounter earlier in the course. And it's a complex idea, and it leads us in very strange directions. If political power potentially flows in every direction, and is potentially implicated in anything that we do as individuals, then it becomes unclear how we begin to resist power, right? If you think of the Marxist conception, power resides in the bourgeoisie. And so if you're going to resist power, then you attack the bourgeoisie through revolutionary struggle. If you think of Locke, for example, power resides in the government that you've transferred your freedom to in the social contract. And if that government begins to abuse its power, then you target the government, right? Through political revolution, through struggle, and if your natural rights are being trampled upon by the government, then you target the government. But Foucault doesn't give us easy answers like that. And for a lot of people, primarily because of that reason, Foucault is controversial. They view what he's doing as irresponsible. They think it even leads us to a position that is apolitical, i.e., there's no clear set of political implications that flow from his writings and his ideas. He doesn't tell us what we ought to be doing in terms of a concrete political agenda. He kind of dodges the normative aspect of political theory, the what should we be doing, the prescriptive element, right? It's like he's telling us to be the Socratic gadfly, but instead of wanting us to shock and sting an unjust society, potentially we're supposed to shock and sting and critically interrogate everything around us. That is a danger with Foucault, and that's one of the reasons why people have problems with Foucault beyond how difficult he is to read and how difficult he is to understand. But I think it's kind of overblown, and we'll talk about why. So anyways, that's a bit of an introduction to Foucault and how he rounds out our semester. What we'll cover today, oops, out of order there. What we'll cover today, we're going to talk about Michel Foucault, the man, and his life, which is a really interesting life. He died fairly young, but had a really interesting experience, while he was alive, and he's a really interesting guy. And we're going to talk about his different conceptualizations of power. Here's some of that fancy, neat language that he creates. He talks about the contract oppression conception of power, the domination repression conception of power, and capillary power, or disciplinary power, which is his contribution to how we understand power and how we understand the operation of power. And then we go into how power actually operates. We actually go into visualizing his conception of power a little bit. And we close with this question of resistance, of what Foucault means for reacting against power, challenging power, critically interrogating power. So a little bit about Foucault the man. He was born in Poitiers, France in 1926. He was actually born into a fairly wealthy family. He was the son of a wealthy surgeon, and it was hoped that Foucault would also become a surgeon, and he didn't, of course. He became a philosopher. He excelled in school, and he was taking courses largely in philosophy and the humanities. And also, when he was in his 20s, he began to suffer from depression. He had mental health issues, and he was sent to see a psychoanalyst, Freudian psychoanalysis, and that led him into a fascination with the field of psychology, his own experience being psychoanalyzed, actually being on the couch and having to explain why he was feeling the way he was. And so he ended up getting advanced degrees in both philosophy and psychology. It was in the 1960s that Foucault began to seriously investigate the operation of power, primarily within social structures and institutions. And this basically set the trajectory of his research for the rest of his life. It wasn't a long life. He died in 1984, so he didn't have a very long intellectual career, but he did a lot in those years in which he was active. He studied the operation of power in non-traditional settings, which is what kind of makes Foucault so interesting. He studied power in the prison system. He wrote a very detailed history of the prison and correction system in Western societies. He studied mental health clinics and insane asylums. He studied the educational system and how power operates there. He also studied power in the realm of science and the history of science and the construction of scientific truth, how different academic disciplines, different scientific fields construct a notion of what constitutes truth and how that changes and evolves over time. And towards the very end of his life, he began to write this multi-volume work on sexuality and how we define normality and abnormality in terms of sexuality. So he didn't study power in the way that we political theorists or political scientists might do so traditionally. Even today, if you were in grad school for political science and you told your advisor that you wanted to study political power, they'd probably look at you kind of funny if you said, well, in order to do this, I'm going to go to mental hospitals and do research there, because I think that's a really important setting in which power operates. We would expect you to study power in the context of the presidency or Congress or local politics, the mayor's office, the governor's office. We wouldn't expect you to go out into these non-traditional settings. But because Foucault thought these settings were absolutely critical to our understanding of power, that's ultimately where he went. That is where he went to conduct his research. Foucault died in 1984 at a fairly young age, and there's a reason for that. Foucault was one of these guys who lived his theory. And one of the things he starts to write about, particularly late in his career, is that one of the ways to step outside the rigid boundaries that society places upon us, these norms and conventions that society instills upon us, inculcates us with, was to what he called transgression of limits. We would transgress limits. So in areas of our lives that really matter to us, our identity, our sexuality, if we break out of the conformity, if we don't conform to a certain set of acceptable boundaries, then we should disregard them, and we should disregard them in our practice. And Foucault thought one of the most rigid, kind of conservative, conformist aspects of our lives was sexuality. He thought that society implants upon us this notion of not only that heterosexuality and monogamy are the norm, but even there's a certain set of expectations with regard to how we behave there. And this was something that Foucault rejected. He felt that sexual identity was not his own sexual identity. He was openly homosexual. He rejected the standard model of monogamy. And while he was in California, he began to experiment sexually. He started to go to settings in which people would be having sex with multiple partners. He engaged in casual sex. He engaged in various forms of sex. But he was doing so at a really dangerous time. I mean, he was doing so at the time that HIV and AIDS were just beginning to emerge. And he was engaging in risky sexual behavior for that time period. And he was one of the first really notable figures to die of complications from AIDS really early on. I mean, if you think about HIV and AIDS, when it emerged, 1984 is really early. We still didn't understand what AIDS was in 1984. We knew that it was a sexually communicated disease, but we thought that it primarily affected homosexual males. And so there were lots of stereotypes, lots of misconceptions about AIDS, that this was a gay man's disease. And there was a lot of actual, anti-homosexual sentiment in terms of how we respond to that, how we respond to the epidemic of AIDS. But anyway, I mean, the larger point is that his risky behavior, his strategy of ethical transgression was poorly timed given the public health risk associated with HIV and AIDS that was emerging at that time. And he was one of the first really notable figures to die of AIDS very early on in the history of the disease. His influence, his intellectual influence is enormous. He was kind of a superstar academic. He was a rock star academic. He taught and gave lectures all over Europe. He held 2 university posts in the United States. He was a very public and well-known intellectual. And his work on power, because power is one of these concepts that operates all across any field of inquiry that we would study, you're going to deal with the aspect of power. He's had an influence in a number of different academic disciplines. Philosophy, political science, political theory, psychology, sociology, anthropology, literature. He continues to be one of the most cited intellectuals in the entire world. So even though a lot of people, particularly for an introductory class, will disregard Foucault either because they don't agree with him or they think because he's too challenging, they're not going to expose students to. I think it's important that we deal with Foucault at the introductory level because he really does have this huge influence, and that influence is only growing. More and more people are turning to Foucault to understand contemporary events, to understand the operation of power. So let's begin to talk about Foucault and his different understandings of power. One of the reasons Foucault is so widely employed within political theory and widely read is the way he reconceptualizes power. He gives us new insights about how to understand the way power operates against us. And so that's what we're going to start with. So essentially, Foucault lays out 3 ways of understanding power, 2 of which he thinks are mistaken, and 2 of which he thinks are kind of antiquated and outdated and don't really apply to our contemporary world. And then he lays out his own conception, which he favors. So we'll go through the 2 that he rejects first. and then we'll talk about his alternative conceptualization of power and spend more time on that. The first conception of power he talks about is the contract oppression conception of power. He also calls this juridical power. Basically, the definition of power, this is the definition of power that we inherit from conceptions of the monarchy, a king, right? And also the social contract. So think here of Hobbes. Think here of Locke, right? This is really the conception of power that we see employed in their work, okay? So the idea in the contract oppression conception of power is that there is a center of power. There is some sovereign authority, okay? And power is a transferable commodity, meaning if you think of just the very idea of the social contract, what we do when we enter into the social contract and we agree to abide by the restrictions of government is that we take our power and we take our freedom and we transfer it to some political authority, and they're going to administer the functions of government for us. They're going to enforce the law for us. They're going to enforce punishment for us, right? So we take that power we have, we transfer it to a single center. Now, that single center could be a president, it could be a parliament, it could be a king. It doesn't really matter what the specific institutional manifestation of power is, but the idea is that power and authority flow outward from a single center, right? Power becomes centralized and it gets directed outward towards subjects. And Foucault rejects that conception of power. He says, that might have applied to the monarchy, that might have applied in earlier eras of human history, but it doesn't give us much of an understanding for the way that power operates in contemporary modern societies. So he ends up rejecting that, and we'll talk about why in a second. But let's talk about his second understanding of power first. His second understanding of power is what he calls the domination repression conception of power. And again, he bounces back and forth in terms of the language he uses here. Another one of the reasons why it's frustrating to read Foucault, because he can be inconsistent in terms of how he refers to something. He also calls this the war repression conception of power. This is a conception of power which he associates with Marx, who we've read, and also Nietzsche and Sigmund Freud, who we haven't read. In this conception of power, power doesn't simply flow from a single center, right? So it moves beyond that contract oppression conception of power. But if we think about power here, what we really see is power flowing back and forth between two opposed forces. So if you think back to Marx, right, which is our reference point, that's where we've been exposed to this conception of power. Marx said that the historical progression occurs as a result of struggle between opposing forces. In his own time, it was the struggle between two opposing classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And he thought that a new era in human history was going to be created by this struggle between, the proletariat working class and the bourgeoisie ownership class. So the working class has a certain set of has a certain kind of set of qualities that give them power. They have numbers. They have the ability to organize. They have this resentment, right, against the bourgeoisie. And so there's an institutional location of power there. But the bourgeoisie also have power. They have money. They have the state at their disposal, right? So if you think about class struggle, it's the struggle between those two opposing forces, and they're challenging one another. They're engaging in conflict with one another, right? So those who view power in this way, those who view power as the domination, repression conception of power, generally see power as rooted in the struggle of something against something else. For Marx, as we said, it was the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It was two different economic classes. For Nietzsche, who we don't read, it was the struggle between what he calls master and slave morality. It was the struggle between individual creativity and self-mastery and the weight of social conformity, the weight of this kind of conformist attitude to obey and meekly accept, right? And that was, he also, according to Foucault, employs the domination, repression conception of power. He just understands it in a little bit different way. In psychology, some of you guys have probably been exposed to Freud. If you've taken an intro psych class, or even if you took psych in high school, you've probably been exposed to Freud a little bit. But Freud views power kind of operating internally. He goes into the internal workings of the human mind. He says that there's this struggle between the id, which is the locus of our sexual desire, right, and the superego, which is kind of the critical, regulative part of the brain. It operates like our conscience. It ensures that we simply don't adhere to what our sexual urges dictate all the time, right? Because we couldn't live if that were the case, at least according to Freud. So anyone who sees power in this way is going to view it as a process of struggle, of one side against another side, one side dominating and repressing some other side. And we can talk about that in terms of economics, society, psychology, ideas. This is the notion of the domination, repression, conception of power. And Foucault also rejects this. He says that even this, it's better than this idea of power in a single center, but it still doesn't capture the way that power operates in modern societies. So that takes us to Foucault's alternative, which we can call capillary power. He also calls it disciplinary power. He calls it a lot of different things. But basically he's saying that if we look at both of those models, if we look at the contract oppression conception of power, the domination repression conception of power, we can't really understand the way that contemporary societies operate if we're using those conceptions of power. If we really want to understand power, we don't look at the state, we don't look at the struggle between opposing forces. He says instead that we should focus, and this is a quote, we should focus on material operators of power towards forms of subjection and the inflections and utilizations of their localized system. We must eschew the model of the Leviathan in the study of power. We must escape from the limited field of juridical sovereignty and instead base our analysis of power of the study of techniques and tactics of domination. Right? So that's quintessential Foucault. Sounds kind of nice. What the heck does it mean? Basically, he's saying that power is diffuse. In our contemporary societies, power is diffuse. It operates without a single center. He says, this is another quote, in thinking of the mechanisms of power, I'm thinking of the point where power reaches into the very grain of individuals. It touches their bodies and inserts itself into their actions and their attitudes, their discourses, their learning processes, their everyday lives. Power is exercised within the social body rather than from above it. This is what Foucault means by capillary power. It's a diffuse understanding of power informed by the actual operation of power from within the social body, within society, rather than above it. So the idea is that we're exposed to acts of power all day long: surveillance, control, suggestion. discipline, encouragement, discouragement of undesirable behaviors, and so on, and so on, and so on. And for him, those effects are much more tangible, much more consequential in our lives than these other forms of power. So, if you want to understand how power operates against me, right? If you want to understand how does power operate against Rob Glover, are you going to look at my relationship with Obama? Are you going to look at my relationship with my congressional representative? Probably not, says Foucault. So, if you want to understand how power operates against me, you might understand quite a bit better the ways in which I'm subjected to control, suggestion, discipline, encouragement, if you look at some of the things which actually touch my life, touch me as a human being. Go talk to my therapist. Go talk to my boss. Go talk to my friends and my peers, my colleagues, and try to get a sense of how they're shaping me, they're molding me as a human being. Okay. That leads Foucault to study power in those unique settings. He says, I could study the traditional governmental complex of power and how it operates there, but I think that in these unique settings, prisons, the school system, insane asylums, I'm going to have a much better understanding of how individuals are being molded, individuals are being shaped, conventions and norms are being created and then administered. That is where we begin to understand how power operates. And that's because in those sorts of settings, the tactics and techniques of power are at their most acute. This is power not only from a distance, but actually, in our lives in a very direct, kind of concrete way. This is the model that Foucault comes up with, and he says this is how we ought to understand power. And if you try and visualize power in that sense, if we were to, normally when I teach this class, I actually draw all of this out. I actually map out power in the classroom and map out these three different conceptions of power. But if you would think about it in terms of the classroom, the contract oppression conception of power would be power flowing outward from a single force. So those arrows, right, would just be directed out in one direction. It would be like a fountain of power directed out, impacting the lives of the individuals who are exposed to power. The domination repression conception of power would have two sets of arrows flowing back and forth. There would be, one group, perhaps if we were doing the classroom, I would be the representative of authority and order and the university and administration. And then you would have the students, right? And you would be the other kind of locus of power. And power would be flowing back and forth between us. There would be two sets of arrows, two centers of power. But disciplinary power is different. Disciplinary power, the arrows would be flowing in every direction. The arrows would be, the directionality of power is every one of us exerting power against everyone around us. And so it becomes a lot more complex. It becomes harder to locate power. But ultimately, Foucault says this is more accurate. This is just a better, a better depiction of how power actually operates in a contemporary society. So one of the techniques that Foucault uses to begin to explain this, to give us a sense of how power operates in a modern society, it's essentially like a metaphor that he uses, is this idea of the panopticon. As I said, Foucault, in order to understand the contemporary operation of power, he went to places where he thought that the operation of power was at its most acute and could most easily be observed. And that is what drove him to prisons. He said, here you really see the operation of capillary power. This is where we begin to understand how power operates. We'll go into his methods a little bit later, but there's this image that Foucault gives us for how to understand power. It's called the panopticon. Panopticon was a design for a prison that emerged in the late 18th century. And it's basically, it was designed to be a more humane form of prison. Prisons up to this point had been largely of the dungeon variety, right? If you did something bad, you got put into a hole in the ground that was dark. And this was actually designed to be a more humane variant of prison, a kind of a more, one that focused less on punishment and more on corrections and shaping individuals to become compliant with expectations and rules and norms, which was a whole movement that emerged in the 19th century. The fact that we talk about our correction system now means that we legitimately believe that the prison and jails in which individuals are housed are meant to correct their behaviors, to make them more compliant and contributing members of society. So this is the design. This is what it looked like. The idea is that you have all the prisoners arranged in a circular fashion, and they're essentially stacked on top of one another. And in the center, monitoring all of the prisoners, is a guard that is in this kind of guard tower that resides at the center of the prison. He or she can look in any direction and see all of the prisoners. And all of the prisoners are arranged around the guard tower in a circular fashion so that they know that they're potentially being watched, they're being surveilled, right? They have that constant reminder that there is authority, that there is nowhere to hide, that they can be seen and surveilled at any time. We get another picture of this from the prisoner's point of view, right? Here you see the prisoner, they're looking outward, and they see that guard tower. They also see all of the prisoners around them, right? They can look across and surveil the prisoners that are across from them, that they can actually see from their cell. And Foucault says that one way to look at that, right, one way to look at this picture is to think about power as kind of residing right here in the center, in the watchtower. That's where the guard is. That's where the guns are. That's where authority lies in this structure, right? That's one way to think about it. But Foucault says no, that's actually only part of it, right? That's you're only getting kind of a small conception of how power operates in this setting if you only focus on the guard tower and the traditional conception we might have of authority and power. The beauty of this system is that the prisoners are all surveilling each other, right? And the tactics of power, the tactics of domination, are eventually such that the prison guard, that tangible and concrete source of authority in the center of the jail, right there, he could eventually leave. The watchtower could be empty. And if you socialize these individuals in such a way, if you discipline them in such a way that they begin to surveil each other and create norms and expectations and forms of discipline against one another, that watchtower could be empty, and all of those individuals eventually will continue to obey and continue to comply. That is the force that they're applying to one another. That is power in operation. Power is often most effective where it's least visible, least thought about. So when we see that guard tower in the center, right, that's a very visible, very unavoidable manifestation of power. But this more subtle operation of power in which everyone is surveilling one another is is really significant. That's what shapes and molds human beings and gets them to comply, and that's where the operation of power really is within this setting. So to give you guys a more concrete example, and this is something I think about a lot as a teacher, but on the day of the final exam, I basically know that in most settings, right, if I were to pass out the final exam, say we're in a classroom setting, I passed out the final exam, and then I were to leave the room for, 15 minutes or something. Go downstairs, take a power nap, come back. I know that it's highly unlikely that anyone would cheat. I know that there's a certain quality of the exam room in which I don't necessarily have to be there to ensure compliance with not cheating, not looking at your notes, not taking your book out, not asking the person next to you what the answer to number 5 is, because I know that you're surveilling each other. I know that there is that you're in some ways enforcing the norms of the course and of the university against one another. Not that I would do that, right? I wouldn't. I think that would be kind of unprofessional if I were to pass out the exam and then leave and go take a nap. But that's the sort of thing that Foucault is analyzing. Modern society, he's arguing, has done something to you for that even to be remotely likely. And so he's interested in what that is. Okay, and he thinks that the panopticon, oddly enough, this conception of a prison and this conception of a prisoner surveilling his fellow prisoners actually is a very good metaphor for how modern society operates, how we all surveil and monitor one another. Foucault basically believes that power exists everywhere, and his intellectual project, his goal, is to uncover how power operates everywhere. Those traditional modes of studying power, he says, those are going to be insufficient. If you want to understand how power operates against you, you're not going to start with your relationship with your president or the traditional conceptions of power. You're not going to start with class struggle, but if you're going to get into this deeper, more subtle level of the operation of power, then you need to find an alternative mode of studying it. And he calls that genealogy. Now, we likely all know this term. We have probably been exposed to the term genealogy. If you engage in genealogy, what are you doing? You're tracing your family. You're tracing your ancestry, right? So you can go to genealogy.com and try and figure out who your ancestors are, who you descend from. In Foucault's usage, it's obviously a little bit different. For Foucault, genealogy refers to the process by which we take a concept, an idea, an event, and we offer an alternative history of that concept's, that event, that idea's development, which undermines or problematizes our original conception. So that sounds kind of abstract, right? But you can think about how Foucault did that just by going back to that notion of capillary power. What did Foucault do with power? He looked at the existing understandings of power. He developed an alternative conception utilizing novel sources by going to schools, by looking at the history of sexuality, by going to prisons, right? By going to clinics and asylums. And the goal, he says, is to entertain the claims of local, discontinuous, disqualified knowledges against the claims of a unitary body of theory. Foucault basically says in order to do this, and to do this well, you have to turn to what he calls subjugated knowledges. These are blocks of historical knowledge which were present but disguised within the body of functionalist and systematizing theory. So if you only ever understand power by reading Machiavelli and Locke and Hobbes, then you're not going to get into the richer, more sophisticated conception of power that you can unlock when you look at the operation of a prison, the design of a prison system, right? So he is entertaining the claims of those subjugated knowledges to develop an alternative way of understanding power. So Foucault says this with respect to how we engage in genealogy. And in particular, if we're going to do this, he says it's important that we apply this method to those things that we think are without history. So when we look at something and we say, well, it's just always been that way, that's part of the human condition, Foucault says no. That's the very moment at which you have to go in and start investigating things and examining things. Because power, how power operates, for example, that does have a history. That has a pretty rich history. And anytime we start to get claims of human nature, or this is how human beings have always behaved, well, we should go in and we should investigate more deeply, because that's probably not the case. Okay, so that's his method. That's how he arrives at the definition of power and the understanding of power, which we've just examined. This leads us to a different question, especially, we talk about this a lot when we talk about power, but usually when you're talking about power, you're oftentimes also talking about the question of resistance. And one of the reasons we actually study power is to think about how we might resist it, or when you can legitimately resist power. And if we think about the notions of resistance that we've encountered earlier in this class, we have a sense of how Foucault might be different in terms of what he thinks about resistance. So think about Socrates, for example. For Socrates, resistance involves critical questioning, but you do so within the bounds of society's laws, right? That's the lesson that we get in the defense of Socrates and the Crito. If we think about Hobbes, we have this very limited definition of resistance. You can resist the government when it's actively trying to kill you, right? That is a legitimate grounds for resistance. For Locke, you can resist the government when it's trampling upon your natural rights to life, liberty, and property. That's his definition of resistance. That is when resistance is legitimate. For Marx, you resist a capitalist society because it's riddled with contradictions. Eventually, the proletariat will rise up. They will overthrow the bourgeoisie. So there is a certain legitimacy in the proletariat overthrowing an unjust and inequitable system. All of these different thinkers give us a conception of when you can resist. But Foucault's resistance is not going to look like any of these, right? If you think about these other conceptions of resistance, Socrates' vision rests upon an ideal of the just society. We critique society when it becomes unjust, but Foucault doesn't have any mechanism like that. Our definition of justice is simply another manifestation of the operation of power. So there's no free-floating ideal of justice that we can appeal to. If you look at Hobbes and Locke, both of those conceptions of resistance rest upon a definition of power which sees power as rooted in the government. Right? You resist against the government because that's the actor that has power. But Foucault doesn't view power in that way. He would likely see the notion of natural rights as just another manifestation of power relations, to be critiqued, to be analyzed. If we turn to Marx, this is a form of political resistance that focuses only upon class domination, and it can't see, according to Foucault, can't see and can't liberate people from the other forms of domination that they face in their everyday life. So we're not simply oppressed and not simply marginalized on the basis of our economic class. So Marx's conception of resistance wouldn't be able to target all of those other forms of power that we face. So again, pretty much all of the preceding definitions of political resistance that we've encountered in this class are going to fall flat. And the question becomes, how do we resist? What is Foucault's method of resistance? Foucault's alternative. It's pretty controversial, it probably doesn't fit with most of the conceptions of resistance that we encounter in our everyday lives, or how we think about resisting the government. We kind of got a sense of this when I was talking about Foucault and his notion of ethical transgression, right, which he was doing sexually in the 1970s and 1980s in California. It's radically individualistic. The individual is the one who experiences power, right? We all experience power as individuals. And so it's largely an individual decision whether or not we're going to resist power, right? But power is not inescapable. It exists alongside the possibility of freedom. Foucault says, at the very heart of power relationships and constantly provoking them are the recalcitrance of the will and the intransigence of freedom. So power can only exist alongside the possibility of freedom. He also says many times that his view of power was not that power is always bad. He thinks that power is essential. I mean, power is just a fact of life. It's not always bad. It shouldn't always be resisted, but power is always dangerous. Power can always be misused. It can always be used to oppress. And so some forms of power are going to be more dangerous than others. And ultimately, the individual is the one who determines this. We have to find those instances in which we as individuals find the operation of power intolerable in our own lives. And we define that for ourselves. We define that as individuals. And we resist power by really in any way we can. But breaking taboos, exposing marginalization, these are some of the ways in which Foucault himself chose to resist power, chose to resist what he viewed as intolerable forms of power. And so we do all this, but we don't expect a resolution. We don't expect that through our attempts at resistance, we are going to emerge from some new, from power to some new utopia, right? All we'll ever get, all we'll ever achieve is some new constellation of power relations. That's the best that we can hope to achieve. And it might be a little bit better, a little bit more tolerable than the previous instances of power relations. But you never completely overcome power, right? Power is ubiquitous. It's a fact of life. It's constantly circulating around us. So Foucault refers to this as a critical principle of resistance rather than a regulative ideal. By that he means it's not a blueprint for a just society. It's not the Republic. It's not Locke's second treatise. It's simply a way that individuals can fight and can resist the complex operation of power in a modern society. So that's what Foucault says about resistance in a nutshell. All right, so that is our last lecture. For next time, there is a clip today. I think it's actually a really good clip. It kind of refers to this idea of the panopticon, which we talked about. It takes Foucault's discussions of capillary power, the panopticon, and it applies them to the contemporary administration of power and surveillance, which has increased enormously as the technology has grown to increasingly surveil society, to watch what people are doing. So that clip is available online. I encourage you to take a look at it and then head over to the discussion board and post your thoughts. Hopefully Foucault hasn't blown your mind too much. I know it's a challenging way to end the course, but I think it's really important because it power is something that flows through so much of political theory, and Foucault forces us to reconceptualize it a little bit. The final exam is going to be tomorrow. It'll be available starting at midnight until 10 p.m. As I said, it's available for that time period, but once you begin the exam in Blackboard, you have 2 hours to complete it, and if you go over the time allotted, then I'll know. Blackboard will tell me. If you do have any questions on the final exam study guide, please contact me. You can get in touch with me via email. If you want to set up a time to chat via the virtual office hours, we can do that as well. So hopefully that's clear. As I said before, as I said with the midterm, if you have any questions, if you run into any technological glitches, if anything doesn't work as it's supposed to, please contact me via email immediately. We'll get it taken care of. Other than that, I think that pretty much wraps up our discussion. And I hope you guys have enjoyed these lectures. I hope you guys have found this helpful and fruitful for you. Please do be in touch with me if you have any questions. All right, thanks.